Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Barry. He is a lecturer in Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. He is an evolutionary biologist with a particular interest in Alfred Russel Wallace. His research combined field and laboratory methods to detect positive Darwinian selection at the molecular level in natural populations. He has also published two books, Infinite Tropics and Alfred Russel Wallace Anthology, and DNA, The Secret of Life with James Watson. Okay, so Dr. Barry, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
It's my pleasure to be here, Ricardo. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about basically the history of how people discovered evolution by natural selection and how evolutionary biology developed over time. So let's start at the beginning. What would you like to say about the history behind Darwin's and Wallace's discovery of evolution by natural selection? And since in your work you focus specifically on Wallace, what were some of his contributions that maybe perhaps if he wasn't present back then would have been left out of the theory? I mean, was there something like that?
Um, so the short answer to what could be a very long answer, obviously the history and development of all of evolutionary biology, is that it is actually kind of remarkable, if you think about it, that Wallace and Darwin essentially independently came up with the same basic idea at more or less the same time. So, and it was the origin of species ultimately that unveiled the theory to a broad audience, but the paper, Darwin and Wallace's joint publication, came out the year before in 1858. Now, Wallace, for one, would certainly say there was virtually nothing that Darwin put in the origin of species that Wallace hadn't thought, that Wallace Darwin missed nothing of Wallace's thinking. Wallace had a particular emphasis on biogeography. Darwin included plenty of biogeography in The Origin of Species. So, to be honest, I don't think, certainly at that stage, there wasn't a lot of divergence between their two ideas. Darwin had been thinking about it a lot longer than Wallace, and Wallace always recognized this. Wallace was almost painfully deferential. He always insisted that this was more Darwin's theory than his theory, that he was a late arrival, that really Mr. Darwin should get all the credit. And to a certain extent, that's reflected in his response to The Origin of Species. Wallace's response to The Origin of Species is, boy, I couldn't have done this. This is fantastic. This is an amazing, this is a beautiful, masterful compilation of facts pertaining to the theory that, yes, I had with Mr. Darwin, but which I hadn't worked out. So, but the question of, to go back into the history here, what I think is really interesting about this, yeah, of course we can talk about Wallace, we can talk about Darwin, we can talk about Lamarck, we can talk about all the great French thinkers, for example, who came before or at the same time as Lamarck and had, if you like, hints of evolutionary thinking. It's a canonical case of standing on the shoulders of giants. What, however, is interesting here, I think there's an important lesson in the history of science to be learned here, is this is an idea that everyone is interested in. Evolution by natural selection. Why do I say that? Well, it addresses and answers so many deeply fundamental problems. Where did we, our species, come from? What is our relationship to the natural world? Where did the rest of the natural world come from? Every person who's ever thought about anything has encountered these questions, which is why every society has a set of stories, creation myths, which essentially address this issue. Where did we come from? Where did other animals, other plants come from? And these are divine stories is some massive struggle between the god of the heavens and the god of the underworld produced something in the interim or whatever. Everyone's thinking about this, and let's face it, the scientific solution, evolution by natural selection, is simple. You can teach evolution by natural selection to a 7-year-old. This is not, you don't have to be Einstein to get this idea. So the interesting question is, why did it take so long? Why did lots of smart people not get there? And why was it mid-Victorian Englishmen, Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, who got there? So my claim, well, it's not my claim, the claim would be that in a sense, the history of the development of this idea is not so much about Alfred Russel Wallace, Charles Robert Darwin, though obviously they're players, they're important figures, don't get me wrong. What it is about is the situation, the intellectual, the scientific, the political, the social milieu in which they found themselves at that time, mid-Victorian Britain, that made, if you like, what had previously been high-hanging fruit, inaccessible scientific ideas right at the top of the intellectual tree, so to speak, that somehow events independent of Darwin and Wallace made that fruit accessible. And so, in a sense, the history of the development of evolutionary thinking shouldn't be the story of Darwin and the Beagle or Wallace struggling in a lifeboat in a small open boat after a fire on his ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, obviously, it's going to be those stories. It should be about what that milieu was, that intellectual scientific milieu in which these guys both independently came across the same set of ideas. And there's all sorts of, I mean, again, there's books written on this, so I can't do it justice, but the fact was they were both heavily influenced by Malthus. Mm-hmm. Malthus was this slightly depressing economist who insisted that because of the exponential capacity for the growth of natural populations, including obviously our population, we were bound to run out of resources which only increase more or less arithmetically. Fine. Now you take that and apply that to the natural world, and you're almost at natural selection. Let's face it, because you've got a huge innate capacity for the increase of populations. Populations don't, though. So what does that imply? That implies mortality. Mortality implies competition. That is basically natural selection. This is Great Britain. This was the first flourishing of a great laissez-faire capitalist economy. This was, if you like, the political and economic offspring of Smith's Wealth of Nations. And what is that? That's that competition is good. Unfettered competition, unregulated competition. It might be messy and inefficient when you zoom in the camera, but zoom out the camera, it's the consumer that's being better served. It's society that's being better served by this process. That's almost natural selection again. Zoom in the camera on natural selection and you're seeing ugly organisms dying and so on and so forth. Pull out the camera. At the end of the day, you have a better adapted population. So those are just two simple things. Malthus, Smith, Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, that sort of set the stage, if you like, that made these previously inaccessible, previously distant ideas much more accessible. Needless to say, there are another 30 bullet points in that list, but I think it's always a bad sign when you answer the first question. It takes most of the interview. So I'll leave it there, Ricardo.
Okay. So at a certain point there you said, or you asked why it took so long for someone to develop the theory of evolution by natural selection. So does that mean that a long time before Darwin and Wallace, people already had at their disposal enough evidence to come up with this theory, or did you mean something else?
I kind of meant that, but yeah, the evidence was there. The evidence is pretty damn obvious, right? I mean, there are two components to the theory: descent with modification, which is you've got a common ancestor, and change, which means that organisms are related to each other. It's no accident you and I look more like a chimpanzee than we do a cow, because we have a common ancestor, a more recent common ancestor with a chimpanzee than we do with a cow. Now, think about what Linnaeus was doing. So this is a good 100 years or so before the voyage of the Beagle. Linnaeus is busily compiling all of nature into a hierarchical taxonomic structure. So he has species which are all similar to each other, clustered into a genus, and multiple genera clustered into families, and so on and so forth. Now, so that's a hierarchical organization. Now, that's an efficient way to organize information. And for Linnaeus, this structure, if you like, to life was evidence of the divine, right? But the evidence, you asked about the evidence, this is exquisite, beautiful evidence. This hierarchical structure is what we now understand to be the history of the branching process of evolution. The evolution was the evidence was right there, literally in front of their eyes, at least on descent with modification. But, and this is where the social and political and technological, and in this case, theological piece comes into play. We're in a deeply religious world. We view the world, science is done by natural theologians. Why are they doing science? They might be motivated, as you and I might be, by curiosity, but they're notionally motivated by desire to understand God. You can understand God in two ways: through his word, the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, whatever your preference is, or through his works. That's an invitation to go out and do science, right? But it's also inhibiting, right? Because when you find something which is marvelous, interesting, sort of very exquisite, what you and I would call an adaptation, when you find that, you don't sort of then go the next step and try and figure out how it arose. You stand back, you raise your hands, and you say, Alleluia, right? So that is the kind. So obviously, religion was a major constraint in terms of the development of these ideas. But I think this is also important. One of the reasons why I believe the Darwin-Wallace thing occurred, this peculiar thing, this coincidence of two mid-19th century Brits getting there, was because of religion. It was actually their journeys, if you like, were powered by religion. Certainly in Darwin's case, Darwin read Paley, who made the most exquisite statement of the so-called argument from design, namely this: God is revealed in his word, in his works. Darwin read that as an undergraduate at Cambridge. He loved it. Thought it was the best thing he got to read at Cambridge. And so he set out on the voyage of the Beagle to do just that, to go and marvel at nature, check nature out, describe nature, catalog nature, with a view to proclaiming the glory of God. So that's one of the, if you like, inhibiting factors. But yes, the general point is the evidence was there. It's not, and as I say, it's not difficult to see, but you needed this confluence of other things to come together to make, if you like, to make it discernible, to make it actually visible.
Mm-hmm. So, since that's the case, and you also emphasized in your first answer the fact that perhaps these ideas also appeared in a particular social and cultural and scientific milieu back in the 1850s, do you think that this theory would have been inevitable in some way, that eventually, even if Darwin and Wallace didn't exist, someone would arrive at this same theory? Of course, this is sort of thought experiment. We can never be sure of that. But what do you think?
I would say absolutely, certainly, yes. Whether it would have been exactly the same theory is obviously open to question. And look, in a sense, I've already answered the question. The fact that you've got two independent thinkers, and they're coming from slightly different worlds. Darwin's wealthy, well-connected, born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Wallace is poor, has no connections. You know, they're on different trajectories. The fact that they both came across this idea in slightly different ways, as we know from the history of Darwin and Wallace. For Wallace, it was a two-step process, two separate publications, which sort of got him over the line. The fact that these two individuals converged on the same idea tells me that those social, economic, whatever forces they were, technological forces, were powerful. So yes, I would be very, and so the counterfactual experiment. Well, what if the voyage of the Beagle sank? The Beagle sank. What if Wallace, as he very nearly did, die in the mid-Atlantic in the course of that 10-day open boat voyage after his ship sank? Would we still be stumbling around in a state of, I don't know, intelligent design or whatever? No. I can't exactly tell you who it would have been who would have made that discovery, but no, as I say, again, I think this is the interesting thing about history of science. Yes, people are important and individuals are important and they are associated with ideas, but it's so much more than that. It's the background, it's the milieu, it's the world in which this thought is being carried out. So the fact was that milieu existed at that time. It infected, so to speak, not a good term to use in times of pandemic, but never mind. It infected Darwin and Wallace. There are plenty of other curious people out there. Remember what Thomas Huxley's response to reading The Origin. Now, Huxley was a smart guy. This was Darwin's famous bulldog. And I mean, he's much more of a sort of cut and thrust, brilliant, sharp guy than either Darwin or Wallace. Darwin and Wallace would be interesting guys. You sit next to them at dinner and have a really interesting conversation. But with Huxley, he's the zing, 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 and the sort of brilliant humor, the brilliant wit, and everything else. Huxley's the smart one, and he has this sort of when I teach it to undergraduate, I call it Homer Simpson moment after he reads The Origin of Species. How extremely stupid of me not to have thought of that. It's bloody obvious, right? So look, I'd say I'm not going to name names, but I suspect the likes of Huxley and others of that ilk would have got there pretty fast if Darwin and Wallace hadn't gotten there. And look, this is a general lesson in the history of science. As you mentioned, I worked with Jim Watson in 2003 on a book to mark the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the double helix. And it's clear as day that if Watson and Crick hadn't figured out the double helix when they did, somebody else would have done, probably within 6 months or a year. Again, there were multiple labs, multiple strains, all became the problem du jour at a critical moment. So, and again, so history of science isn't, and so they were just lucky. I mean, so obviously they were smart and lucky, but history of science is more about the background, the milieu, the world, than it is about those particular individuals. And same definitely applies to Darwin and Wallace. So yes, we would still be talking about evolution. We wouldn't call it natural selection, almost certainly, if it hadn't been for Darwin and Wallace. Maybe we'd be talking about survival of the fittest, which of course was Herbert Spencer's term, and was a term preferred by Wallace over Darwin's term natural selection, for good reason, by the way. This is a complete sidebar, but this is one of my favorite pieces of Wallace trivia. If you look at his copy of The Origin of Species, which he loved, as I said, he's gone through with the pen and crossed out every reference to natural selection. Now that's quite a labor of love in The Origin of Species, and he's inserted in very fine handwriting his preferred alternative, which is survival of the fittest, which was, as I say, Spencer's term. Now, why is that? Uh, Wallace really didn't like the term natural selection, and he didn't like Darwin's insistence in the first chapter, mainly chapter 1 of The Origin, of the analogy between artificial selection and natural selection. So Darwin introduces his one long argument with a discussion of pigeons, famously, which were the sort of popular breeding, sort of weird breeding animals du jour. Today, when I teach this, I tell students to think about dog breeds, for example. It's amazing what we breeders can do in terms of altering the behavior, the anatomy, the physics, God, everything of organisms. And we know how we do it. If I wanted a stupid dachshund, I say that with all due respect to dachshund lovers, what I breed from the thinnest dog with the shortest legs, and then I'll get ever thinner and shorter legs and so on and so forth. We know how that works. This was Darwin's idea. So he said, well, that's what we do. So nature does the same thing, if you like, and that's how we get change through biology. Wallace hated that, and he's right. His point was the whole thing with artificial selection is you are the selector, right? You, the breeder, are choosing the long, thin dogs with short legs, right? There is an agent involved. And the whole point with natural selection, and the key point with natural selection, as Wallace said to Darwin, is there is no agent involved. That's the big thing. There's no teleology. There's not seeking anything. This is just this capricious process where the ones that happen to be the lucky variants survive at a higher rate than the other ones. But if you're going to use the term selection, says Wallace, and if you're going to make this analogy, people are going to think there is a selector, maybe a divine selector. So, Mr. Darwin, Wallace writes, by choosing this terminology, you're, if you like, pulling the rug from under the very theory that it purports to describe. That's why Wallace preferred preferred survival of the fittest to the term natural selection. Sorry, that was a bit of a sidebar, but it is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So, I mean, we have evolution by natural selection. Can we say that evolutionary biology as a discipline only started developing after that, or can we go back a little bit perhaps to Lamarck and others?
Well, that's kind of a semantic issue, insofar as what do we consider to be evolutionary biology. Um, Arguably, you could say that Linnaeus was doing evolutionary biology in creating a fairly accurate plan, taxonomic hierarchy of the natural world. He wasn't doing it for, if you like, sectarian scientific reasons. As I say, his impulse was essentially religious. But what he's doing is evolutionary biology, even if his motivation is different from modern evolutionary biologists. So as they ultimately just becomes a semantic issue of whether or not you consider, if you insist that to be an evolutionary biologist, you have to be interested in covering let's say, a non-divine picture of the universe, for example. But I guess I would certainly be comfortable calling Lamarck an evolutionary biologist. I would probably say Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, his colleague at the Natural History Museum in Paris, was also an evolutionary biologist. They were interested in seeing connections between forms of life that their positions as expert anatomists gave them more insight into than other people. So yes, but it's a sort of blurry definition from being a natural philosopher who's entirely motivated by a desire to understand God, segueing through to what we call the modern scientist, and somewhere in that gray area we'll say we have the birth of normal/genuine evolutionary biology.
So, and when we move a little bit forward to Gregor Mendel and Mendelian genetics, what did it add to the picture of evolutionary biology? I mean, what were some of the elements that Darwin was missing that we got insights about from Mendelian genetics?
Well, if you think about it, the theory of natural selection is an explicitly genetic theory. It's a theory about transmission genetics. It's essentially making the statement that, yes, these individuals, the zebras that run fastest in the population will survive at a higher rate because they run away from the lions more effectively, and therefore they'll pass on their fast running genes more effectively, so the next generation will be enriched for those fast running alleles. It's an explicitly genetic theory, and it was a serious drawback for Darwin, as you know, that he didn't have Mendel. There are various sort of urban myths in science that he had an uncut copy of Mendel's papers, or paper I should say, in his library, and that it was his lack of enthusiasm for detailed scientific German, which is understandable, which caused him never to read it. It's not true. He didn't have a copy. I mean, we basically have all of Darwin's library. It's now at Cambridge University Library, and there wasn't such a copy. And the other thing, which I think is interesting, is if Darwin read Mendel, he wouldn't have got it. Mendel, in my opinion, was way ahead of his time. Mendel was bizarrely trained as a physicist. He studied in Vienna, at the University of Vienna, with Christian Doppler, among others, of Doppler effect fame. So when he then went back to the monastery, well, he was training in order to pass an exam so that he could become a teacher, so a monk teacher, so a schoolmaster, basically. He failed the exam twice, and in fact never therefore was qualified to be the teacher he should have been, because he was actually apparently a brilliant teacher. But after failing it the second time, he went back to the monastery, and it was there that he was encouraged by his abbot Knapp, to do experiments. And the idea of how traits are passed on was something which plenty of people were interested in at the time. There were plenty of people doing experiments, and that's what Gregor Mendel decided to do. And there were a couple of things that worked out in his favor. One of which was that he was somewhat serendipitously lucky, and he chose a really good system to do this in, with nice discrete character states. So this is the famous P's. You've got nice binary traits: wrinkled, round, green, yellow, purple, white for the flowers, and so on. And these things, it turns out, are very handily determined. They're all monogenic. They're determined by single genes and two alleles, one recessive, one dominant. So it just so luckily he found a super simple system. Well, luckily, and he was smart in that he was looking for something which was tractable. But the other thing is, he brought mathematical thinking to biology, which previously the two were not really aligned at all. Sort of applied math was what physics did, and bio went out and described things in nature. And if you think about it, the Mendelian process is complicated. It's weird sort of form of doubled up combinatorics. So you need to really be able to think in a quantitative manner to get Mendel. And the reason, Mendel was famously neglected until his rediscovery in 1900. The reason, I think, and by the way, it wasn't that he wasn't read. I believe there's something, and I don't keep up with this, but I think there's like 35 citations of Mendel between 1866, when he published, and 1900. So, that's one a year, which is better than plenty of papers I've published. So he wasn't unread, but he was not understood. And Darwin, who in his own characterization was amathematical, his struggles as an undergraduate were all in math classes. Darwin would be the last person you'd expect to make the conceptual leap from describing organisms to actually understanding that process in a very quantitative way. So no, Darwin didn't have Mendel, but Darwin soon came to realize that he had a problem on his hands. When famously, it was in 1867, so this was 8 years after the publication of The Origin, he was critiqued by a very smart Scottish engineer called Fleemin Jenkin, who pointed out that Darwin's sort of implicit model of transmission genetics was the death knell for natural selection. So Darwin was implicitly embracing blending, a model which we dub blending inheritance. What does that mean? Basically, it means you take a tall person and a short person. Junior is going to be of middle height. You cross a black mouse with a white mouse and you produce a sort of gray mouse or whatever. And this often seems to work. It's sort of intuitively fairly appealing that the offspring are somewhere sort of the midpoint of their parents. But as Fleeman Jenkins pointed out, if that's the case, everything is going to converge on the mean as the generations proceed, because if let's say you've got your black and white mouse with gray in the middle, you've got a bell-shaped curve. The only way you're going to keep a pure black mouse is if a black mouse breeds with another black mouse. Now, on average, given the black is one extreme of the bell curve, that's not going to happen. The black is going to breed with another gray, and so here's the black here, here's the gray here, so junior is going to be in the middle. So you're going to lose the ends of the distribution. That's going to happen in generation 1. You're going to lose a little bit more in generation 2, generation 3, and so basically everything is going to converge on the mean. And that's true. That's what would happen with blending inheritance. So Darwin recognized that he needed a pushback on this, and essentially his response to this was the theory of pangenesis, which is a particulate idea. So the key thing here is you need a non-blending model. And non-blending is particles which can combine into different configurations. We call them heterozygotes, right? But which don't get just sort of blended together. So, I mean, think of a heterozygote. You've got big A and little a. It's not that they become a sort of half-sized A together. No. And then they can reconstitute in meiosis, and you've got a big A gamete and a little a gamete. So Darwin was smart enough to recognize he needed something particulate. His idea of pangenesis was a monumental piece of bullshit. It's actually rather charming and brilliantly wrong. And it was all about these tiny particles he called gemmules that were trafficked through the bloodstream. So if you were, the zebra running fast, your big thigh muscles would be producing lots of gemmules, and those would then accumulate. The big thigh muscle signal would accumulate, those gemmules would accumulate in the gametes, and then the zebra would pass those gemmules on to the next generation, and the next generation would accordingly have beefy thigh muscles, right? That was the model. Brilliantly disproved, by the way, by his own cousin, Francis Galton. Galton did a nice experiment. He took blood out of a black rabbit, injected it into a white rabbit, and conjectured that now you've got black bunny gemmules in the white bunny, right? So the white bunny, if we breed it with another white bunny, should produce gray bunnies, right? Mm-hmm. According to pangenesis. No, of course, a white bunny bred with a white bunny, even if it's had a blood transfusion from a black bunny, produces white bunnies. So Darwin was kind of screwed, and of course died in 1882 before that rapprochement with Mendel occurred. The rediscovery of Mendel was 1900, then took another 15, 20 years before the actual marriage, if you like, between these two ideas, Mendelian genetics on one hand and evolution by natural selection on the other hand, could actually come together. And you had this weird, you would have thought, 1900, finally, natural selection has a working mechanism of transmission genetics. Thank you, Mendel. Good, right. Finally, we can get to work. No, there was this lengthy period really ugly period. Huge disagreement between the so-called biometricians, led mainly, well, partly by Galton, which said that all variation is continuous. So, yes, Mr. Mendel has studied a special case where you've got wrinkled round green yellow, but that doesn't, I mean, you look at human height, it's not like you're either 5 foot, 5'6" or 6 foot tall, right? So that was the so-called biometrician point of view, and the Mendelians were, hello, Mendel works, we know that. And so there was this ugly spat, which was only eventually, I mean, arguably resolved by R.A. Fisher with an impenetrable paper published, I think, in 1917, in which he pointed out that if you have two things, polygenic inheritance, so the trait you're interested in human height is not determined by one locus, as in the sort of classical Mendelian monohybrid state, but is determined by many. That's one factor. You then expect a bell curve of distribution. It's still going to have elements of a step function in it, depending on the number of genes that are involved. But that plus some environmental variation. So you Ricardo, might have an identical twin, and you are genetically expected to be 5'8" tall. Sorry, I'm in America, so I'm using imperial measurements. You're going to have to do the translation into meters. But your identical twin, who tragically was malnourished because you were such a greedy child and grabbed all the food, is significantly shorter than you simply because of a poorer developmental environment. So Fisher's argument, and this is where we're still at essentially, is you put those two things together, polygenic inheritance, so each trait is determined by many underlying loci, many underlying genes, plus some environmental input, which, if you like, wiggles that the genetic settings, then you've got a biometrical distribution, and you've got that reconciliation between Mendel and Darwin. But it came, 50 years. So we had 35-year hiatus until Mendel is rediscovered, and then you have another 15 years. So it's a 50-year wait for those two theories, which needed each other in a sense to come together.
So I want to ask you about population genetics, but before we get into that, did Darwin talk about levels of selection, or did he have a particular level where he thought selection occurred? Like, for example, the level of the individual, the population, the species, or some other level?
Um, so I'm not enough of a Darwin scholar to give you a good answer on that, but I'll give two comments. In general, I think he was completely comfortable with expected selection on the level of the individual, right? And again, and this is going back to the analogy that Wallace so hated. If you're trying to breed a pigeon with some stupid plume of feathers on its head, you take that individual with the most plumes and breed it with the female with the most plumes as well, and you kill the other individuals. So that's, if you like, doctrinaire natural selection at the level of the individual. One thing that Darwin legitimately worried about was the evolutionary altruism, which seems to be, and this, that can be in our species, where we're apparently helping out other individuals, maybe even unrelated individuals, at a cost to ourselves. We go to war and get killed for some idea of nation or whatever. Or it can be in other species. So social insects being the most canonical case. Individual selection would seem to mandate that everyone should be trying to produce as many offspring as possible, should be surviving for as long as possible and reproducing as much as possible. And yet, here you have, in a honeybee colony, you have Her Majesty the Queen, and everyone who's the only, and that with her stored sperm from her mating flight. So you have two reproductive individuals in a colony of thousands and thousands of individuals. So in other words, all those workers have elected to be sterile, ostensibly. And so Darwin worried about these things. And there's various people think that he was groping towards what today we call kin selection, or some sort of form of selection based on relatedness vis-a-vis the insect situation. But in the human situation, at least, he certainly sort of, if you like, created a levels of selection argument to try and explain human altruism. And so this was so it's a group selection argument where you've got intergroup selection. And the scenario he created was that you have two tribes or whatever of warring peoples, one of which is altruistic. The individuals look after each other. So in other words, when you and I, Ricardo, we're members of this group, we're fighting a battle, and I see somebody running in behind you to put an axe through your head or whatever, I throw myself between. I save your life, Ricardo. Maybe becoming seriously injured myself. Okay, so so Darwin's got two tribes, one of which does that, which has you might call the noble impulse, and the other which is not. So, I see somebody coming up to kill you. You might be on my side, but I'm not going to put myself out to save you. Okay. Now, and his argument is who wins that battle? Well, it's the guys that are looking out for each other and helping each other, because they're going to be a more effective fighting unit. So, and sometimes we would call that interdeme selection or group selection. So, yes, Darwin definitely sort of wandered into areas of non-individual selection. I don't think that there's any, I'm not the right person to ask, but I'm not aware of any explicitly species level selection that he was making, though he certainly makes sort of general statements. I mean, for instance, very interested in invasive species, how they seem to do very well in their new environments and so on. You could infer there's an element of sort of key traits associated with particular species which give them advantages over other species. You might call that species selection. Species selection is one of those terms which means 450 different things to the 450 people who've thought hard about it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so what is population genetics and what was its importance in the history of the development of modern evolutionary biology?
Well, when you say what is population genetics is super simple in principle. It's just an application of Mendelian genetics at the population level. I mean, Mendel was thinking in terms of pedigrees, so a particular lineage. Population genetics is simply generalizing that to a population which consists of a whole bunch of pedigrees, which may or may not be ultimately all related to each other via a common ancestor. So and it's actually quite interesting. The history of genetics, if you go back to the early history of genetics, there really was no distinction between a population geneticist and a geneticist. So in the teens and 20s, probably into the 30s, there were people who, you did them both. That was part of the brief. So it was a sort of later thing that they became sort of slightly compartmentalized. But population genetics, and I'm a population geneticist, so I'm possibly biased on that, is absolutely the bedrock, the most fundamental, the most important part of all of biology. End of story. Okay. It's the engine by which the evolutionary process occurs. And it was absolutely critical in the early development of evolutionary thinking. As I say, essentially, with Fisher, we've got that rapprochement, as I described earlier, between Mendel and evolution by natural selection. You've still got a problem, which is intuitively, natural selection is such a blundering, ugly, messy process. a few zebras that run faster survive, but some of the fastest running ones won't survive anyway. They'll die of disease, let's say. And some of the fat, slow ones will survive because they were lucky, right? I mean, they happened to be hiding behind a rock when the lions arrived or whatever, okay? So the bottom line is this process just seems mind-blowingly inefficient. Mm-hmm. And so the question, and there was this period in the history post-Darwin, in the history of evolutionary biology, which Peter Bowler, among others, have written about, in which essentially natural selection was, everyone had to be on board with descent from modification, because it was manifestly, as I said before, you look at a chimpanzee, you're looking at a cousin, right? I mean, that's simple. But is natural selection really capable of doing what Mr. Darwin claims it's done, given how clumsy, how unwieldy, how messy it is? And only with the application of mathematics can you demonstrate that incontrovertibly. So that was the first and all-important role of population genetics, or theoretical population, mathematical population genetics, early in that marriage between Darwin and Mendel, so to speak, was to demonstrate, yes, if you integrate over long periods of time, even if the selection coefficients are super small, even if the process is messy and inefficient, with enough time, you're getting vectored deterministic change. You get natural selection, in other words, works pretty much in the way that Darwin envisaged it. So yeah, the first, I would say, key feature of mathematical population genetics was to reestablish natural selection as the key driver of the evolutionary process.
Mm-hmm. So what are the other things, perhaps mechanisms that people had to find out occurred in evolution, and maybe some sub-disciplines of evolutionary biology that had to develop for us to get to what in evolutionary biology people call the modern evolutionary synthesis?
Well, so that could be a very big question, or I can simplify. I'm going to simplify it. I mean, so in a sense, we had to find more fossils. We had to develop in much more sophisticated ways our interpretation of the fossil record and so on. We had to develop more effective tools to understand the branching history of life. So that's phylogenetic technology and so on and so forth. But that's all, I would say, somewhat secondary. The way I see it, you need two things for the theory of evolution to work. One is what I've just described, namely microevolution. So that is change within a population. So you've got mutation feeding variation into population. What is the fate of that variation, of that mutation? It drift, selection, whatever. Okay, and we've got a whole slew of ideas of what can happen, and we've got a really elaborate and beautiful set of both analytical models and simulation-based models to understand that process. But essentially, it's this: if a new mutation arises in a zebra population that makes it run faster, on average, not necessarily, but on average, that will increase over time from generation to generation to generation until eventually all zebras are fixed for that fast-running mutation. Fine, that's part one. That is, as I say, the engine of the evolutionary process. The second component has to be speciation, because I've still got a population of zebras, right? The second key component has to be, how do lineages split over time? And those splits in your phylogenetic tree are speciation events. So that is absolutely the second key component of a working theory of evolution, which is an understanding of what we formally call cladogenesis, the splitting of the phylogenetic tree. And the process of speciation. Now that, yes, so there was a very frankly, dogmatic model of speciation associated with the modern synthesis. The modern synthesis is in part a reflection of the individuals and their, well, rhetorical skills to a certain extent involved. And as I say, dogmatic, supremely effective at marshalling evidence, and very effective self-advocate was Ernst Mayr. And he became the dominant. So he's a systematist, actually, a bird systematist by training, but he became associated with what speciation is and how it works in the mid-century of the 20th century. Is essentially the establishment and solidification, concretization of the modern synthesis. And there's plenty of revisionism in the world of speciation. Is a brilliant, beautiful, fascinating, messy topic about which nobody can agree on anything. I mean, everything in speciation is up for grabs. Everything is controversial. But remarkably, this is partly because it's not been worked on that much. Yes, we've had lots of people doing population genetics. We have plenty of people go and dig up fossils in the fossil record. Speciation is tricky because it operates on what you might call an intermediate timescale. The fossil record, fine, you've got dinosaur A in stratum 1 and then dinosaur B in stratum 2, and you can, there are differences between A and B, and you can sort of conjecture about what was going on, okay? That's on a mega time scale. If you're doing population genetics and you're interested in looking at allele, a new mutation is introduced into this population, maybe in a breeding cage in a laboratory, and you can watch the increase, you can sample the population repeatedly over time, or you can compare a population on this island to a population on another island. They split about 1 million years ago, so you can make some conjectures about the differences which have arisen since. So that's a short time scale. That's a short time scale. This is a really long time scale. Speciation is pretty much in the middle. Okay, speciation takes typically many generations, but we don't have the sort of resolution of the fossil record that allows us actually to witness the process. So it sort of falls in the middle between the two areas in which we can study. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's been sort of neglected over time. It's difficult to study, but boy, is it central. Boy, is it interesting. And by the way, super simple. I mean, Mayr was, I would say, 90% right. He insisted that the key thing was that your two, we'll call them incipient species. So we'll start with one population up here. So this is time. We've got one population up here. We're going to split it into two populations, which are geographically isolated from each other. So, and we can do that however we can want. We can put one on an island or whatever. To start with, they're genetically identical, the two populations. They're just half of the parent population. But over time, they are going to become more. So if we are x-axis is genetic difference, they're going to become more and more different because new mutations are going to arise in this population, which are not going to be present in this population. New mutations are going to arise in this population, which are not present in this one, and so on. So you've got independent evolutionary trajectories. They're just going to accumulate genetic differences over time. So and that's inevitable. Mutation occurs, right? It's a thermodynamic inevitability. And the chances that the same mutations would occur in the two populations is close to zero. So what does that mean? It means over time, those two populations are going to become more and more different. What is speciation? Speciation is when you've got two populations which are sufficiently genetically different from each other, they cannot interbreed, right? So and this is essentially Mayr's argument that, yeah, you let that process run for long enough, and you've got two things which can't interbreed. We'll call them two new species. So, yes, there are two key components to the theory of evolution. One, population genetics, microevolution. Two, speciation. Once you've got those two things in place, and 3.9 billion years of life or whatever to play with, then everything follows.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I mean, we've got to the modern evolutionary synthesis. I mean, I would like to get into other things, perhaps some breakthroughs that occurred in evolutionary biology after in the second half of the 20th century, but I guess that would take a lot of time. So, should we end the interview here and continue in another time? Or?
Yeah, that's fine by me. Yes, I mean, you're right. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
Yes, it's possibly true that I'm not the most efficient in terms of time use in talking about these things, but they're all interesting at least.
Yeah. Okay, so before we go, are there any good places on the internet where people can find your work?
On the internet. I mean, yeah. So there is. I can't remember when I last updated it. I have a website through Harvard which links to some papers and so on. So yes, I would go there. I suppose. I mean, if you Google Andrew Berry Harvard, it'll get you there. It's complicated because actually, it was a great kid. There was a Harvard football player. When I say football player, I'm talking about the American game, which doesn't involve balls or feet. But anyway, shoulder pads and helmets. There was a guy who had the same middle initial. It was an initial as me, Andrew J. Berry, who I think graduated from Harvard in 2008, so a long time ago. Anyway, he's this brilliant athlete who's one of Harvard's best ever American football players. He's now, I think, the general manager of one of the NFL teams. So he's done super well, and he's a superstar. But he's my problem insofar as if you Google Andrew Berry Harvard, because obviously everyone who wants to write an article about an American football superstar wants to mention the fact that he did his undergraduate at Harvard, where he was a star actually. Anyway, so I'm just saying you might have to persist. You might put Andrew Berry Evolution Harvard. And the other Andrew Berry and I used to get each other's email all the time, obviously, and he would get boring administrative emails to me, and I would get endless emails of loving enthusiasm from young women, which were absolutely not intended for me, but for him. Anyway, yes. So Google Andrew Berry Harvard Evolution, and that should get you there.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving some links to your work in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Berry, thank you again a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and let's arrange another conversation in the future.
Okay, my pleasure, Ricardo.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with top academics and scholars from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, I also have links to that in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please leave a like, share it, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke and Blanchett Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henrik Elenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windeger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Jugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, and Yannick Punter. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michal Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.